communities and regions of the territory, because the way it looks right now, it's a one-size-fits-all, and it fits the southern part of the territory, not so much the northern part of the territory. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, or Mr. Chair. I'm having trouble with my microphone here too, or my hearing piece. First of all, I want to make a couple of comments on this, I guess, because I've stated in the House that Hay River is the primary logistical point for our operation. It does have the synchro lift there for lifting and maintaining and be able to operate our repairs on our vessels and our barges, which is very significant to this whole operation. So Hay River is a key point, and it's got the most northern rail link in Canada. So that's where all the fuel comes from. But one of the things I think that that's come out of this already that we've talked about with our staff here is we want to have a look at doing a regional contingency plan for infrastructure for to help mitigate these extreme types of events. So I think I can make that commitment here in the House today that we're going to have a look at doing that for the Beaufort region. Now, the member asked me in the House about Tuktoyaktuk, if we would look at doing something there. But one of the things I think that would come out of this this contingency plan issue would be, is there a possibility of using Tuk for staging fuel, because there's already some infrastructure there in place. This is the type of things that would come out of doing this. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Nekomayak.
I think this error that just occurred with this airlift going on is, I don't think we really need a survey to realize that there's what they found, storage for goods, for dry goods overnight, and whether it be in Tuktoyaktuk or in N.W.T. I think those places logistically can be a good place. We're talking, the minister's talking about maintenance to barges. You can bring a barge up the river to do maintenance on it, every year, every 2 years, whatever it may be. The bottleneck on Great Slave Lake, when they're still full of ice and the Mackenzie River is open, is the actual bottleneck, is where we don't get our goods until the barge doesn't leave until July or even later. So having a barge, in years past we've had them in August, and now to have them canceled in October, I think we really need to take a hard look and see what doesn't, like I mentioned in the House, that MTS needs to be run more like a business, not like a government. And I think we need to differentiate between the two so that they have better operations for the upcoming seasons. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Anything from the minister? Sorry, Mr. Nekomayak.
Mr. Chair, getting back to operations, my question to the ministers, they're looking at possibly doing that down the road. That's not going to be within the next year or 2 years. The next year going into election mode. And maybe would they look at having some SUPs for possibly doing that once the study comes out in March of 2019? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Nekomayak. Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The member keeps calling this an error, and he keeps trying to blame MTS, and that's not the case. It's, as I did in my member statement, there's a whole types of events that happened that caused this problem. And it all started off, as I said in the House the other day with my minister's statement, that's why we're sitting here, was because of the high water, it knocked all the buoys out, the delivery of fuel to the Hay River terminal that didn't meet spec, that delayed the scheduling to all the communities again. And then this multi-year sea ice that came down, and we worked very closely with Coast Guard. We're taking lessons learned from this. One of the things I think that strikes me the most already, and we're making plans to already address this, is our communications within our department of MTS. We're committed to hiring another person that works closely with the communities on a case-by-case basis of people's freight. But I'm not going to sit here and take it that saying this was an error of our department. This was a multitude of things. That's a bad sea ice, non-spec fuel, high river conditions that knocked the buoy out. We're looking at the best we can to service these communities. We took the unprecedented event to fly everything in that we can, and those things are taking place as we speak. We've talked to every customer in every community. Paulatuck had 33 customers. We reached out and talked to every one of them. We've put people on the ground in each community to be able to unload and deliver people's freight as we continue to move forward. We've committed to getting the fuel in there. The one thing that we're not going to do, and we're going to take the unprecedented step, is we're not going to hurt the vehicles in. And we're going to, as a department, we're looking at rebating all the customers for the freight for their vehicles for the next coming season. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister. Anything further for Mr. Nakimayak?
Yeah, well, you know, thank you, Mr. Chair. There, on the website, there were 3 delivery dates. So, you know, the first one was August 12th, I believe, and that would have been an acceptable time. The minister mentioned to me during committee meeting that the fuel it failed inspection in Norman Wells. How could the fuel get all the way from Hay River to Norman Wells and only getting inspected at that point? I think that's where you need to look at that. And obviously, like I said, somebody was asleep at the wheel somewhere, and I think we need to look at this as a learning lesson for everybody, and ensure that, you know, residents. For myself, I believe in the, you know, and the minister in his work. It's the calls that I get from, you know, constituents, you know, even from out of the territory. So I think we need to take a hard look at this and ensure that the team's not asleep anywhere, you know, at any given point. It's a very important delivery, and it's a small window of operations. I think the department needs to realize that it's a small window of operations. Once that window is lost, then this is what it comes down to at the end, and it's a very expensive mistake for the N.W.T and MTS, and I think we need to look at how we can improve upon, you know, that the next coming years. And you know, I'm sure that they're looking at that now. So there's a lot of lessons learned. And like I said, the department needs to be accountable for it. And we can't just let this fly by. You know, the $5 million mistake it's not a cheap one. I'm just wondering what other programs are going to be cut because of this error. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Nakimayak. 5 seconds left on the clock, but I'll allow the minister to provide a response. Minister Schuman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll make it very quick. First of all, on the Norman Wells comment, I'm sticking by that comment. That was a fuel delivery to a customer in Norman Wells. It wasn't our fuel. It was a different customer's fuel. It was from the same supplier that caused the issue in Hay River. So there was, I couldn't tell you the exact number of liters of fuel, but it was a significant amount that we had to transport back for that. As for passing on or what it's going to cost other programs and services, is not going to. I've already told this House we're going to revolving fund for petroleum is going to eat the delivery of fuel, and MTS's revolving fund is going to eat the delivery of goods to the customer. So it's not going to affect any other programs. It's one of the nice reasons why MTS is outside of the Government of Northwest Territories. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Next, I have Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I want to ask the minister some questions about his October the 18th statement on marine transportation services. In here, the minister, and he just talked about it, that there's 2 revolving funds that the costs for airlift are going to be assigned to. The first is the Petroleum Products Revolving Fund, and the second is the Marine Transportation Services Revolving Fund. Can the minister or his staff tell me what the current balance is in either of those, or in both of those 2 funds? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Mr. McCormick.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. At the current time, there is a balance or accumulated surplus of about $870,000 in the MTS revolving fund and $500,000 in the Petroleum Products Stabilization Fund. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, that's not a very large balance in either of those funds. There's no way that those balances, will these balances cover the additional shipping costs that are anticipated for airlifting of fuel and other goods to these communities? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. McCormick.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Those balances are sitting where the surpluses are sitting at the moment. There is sufficient cash reserves in the revolving funds to pay for these. So there are resources within either revolving fund to actually cover these payments. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So can I find out what then the cash reserves are for both of these funds? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Mr. McCormick.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't have the cash figure for the petroleum products revolving fund right in front of me. In terms of MTS, there is approximately $22 million in cash that is still sitting in the revolving fund from the last 2 years' operations. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. O'Reilly?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I guess I'm trying to understand what the difference is between the cash balance and the reserves that are in these two funds. Can I get a commitment from the minister to table in the House some sort of balance sheet for each of these revolving funds that indicate what the cash reserves are, what the cash balance is, and so on, so we actually understand how much is available to cover off the additional shipping costs for each of these, for the items that have to be airlifted. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Minister?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We can do that, but I can also bring it to our briefing next week for MTS as well. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister. Mr. O'Reilly?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I'm not sure, is the briefing next week, is that going to be done in public? And is the minister prepared to bring that information forward to the briefing? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Minister, some clarification?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yep, I believe the briefing will be in public and we can supply that at the same time. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yes, that's great. Can the minister also bring forward even a rough cost estimate of what these airlifts are going to cost? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Minister?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We can, yeah, it'll be a rough cost estimate, but we can bring that forward. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister. Mr. O'Reilly?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I look forward to getting that information. In the minister's statement, I think it's down on page 4 here, he talks about how there's going to be a $19.5 million investment in procuring 4 double-hulled barges. Are those expenses related to those barges? Is that going to come out of the Marine Transportation Services revolving fund as well? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister.
Yes, our portion's coming out of the MTS revolving fund. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Will those charges be part of the financial report that the minister is going to bring forward for the public briefing? These 4 double-hulled barges? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Minister?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, we can do that as well. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. O'Reilly?
I don't have any further questions at this point, Mr. Chair, but I thank the minister for those commitments and look forward to getting the information in a public forum. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Next, Mr. Nadley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, it's very concerning and in terms of what's happening way up north. Like we in the southern Northwest Territories, have the highways to transport our goods and services to our communities. But unfortunately, people that live way up north, a lot of their goods and services have to be brought in by barges, or sometimes, in this extreme example, flown in because they don't have no other choice. So I really sympathize with my colleague that spoke in terms of ensuring that people from those communities got some answers. My question is very basic, and maybe the minister had an opportunity to provide some very strong rational reasons in terms of why MTS has to be situated in the Hay River. It just makes sense that at this point that the center of operations should be considered perhaps in the Beaufort Delta, so that the operations could easily be made and adjustments be made. So my question is to the minister: why does MTS the base of operations needs to be based in Hay River. Let's see.
Thank you, Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So as I've laid out before, first of all, how are you going to get how are you going to haul millions of liters of fuel to Tuktoyaktuk? We can do that. That's by truck. Trucking is going to cost you a heck of a lot of money to get the fuel up there. Way more than it ever is going to be on a railhead to bring it to Hay River. The terminal is there. It's the most northern railroad in Canada. We also have, as I said, the synchro lift there, which is millions of dollars of assets to build something like that up there, to be able to lift the barges and the vessels out of the water to do maintenance and repair on them. It just clearly makes sense to operate out of Hay River logistically. And if a guy sat down and did the numbers on the freight alone, just to haul fuel to Tuktoyaktuk wouldn't make sense. It's all done on sheer volume. Fuel is what is the whole reason of MTS's existence to start with. And deck freight became an extra. Fuel is a necessity that had to be shipped to all the northern communities and the D&D sites. And that's the largest percentage of our revenues. And I can't see where Tuk being the head port would make any sense besides a contingency location at this point. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister. Mr. Nadley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to thank the Minister for providing that insight as to why the base has to be in Hay River. And the Minister speaks very confidently in terms of how decisions were made to ensure that the base continues to exist in Hay River. And he made reference to, the volume of trucking and the costs of perhaps the railroad. If there has been studies, could he make perhaps those studies and their maybe analysis to committee level in this House? Let's see.
Thank you, Mr. Nadley. Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm going to need him to repeat his question.
Thank you, Minister. Mr. Nadley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question was, the Minister makes reference very confidently to, the transportation through the trucking industry in terms of bringing fuel to Hay River, either by railroad as well, and also that, there's maybe, he seems to suggest that there has been some analysis and whether there's been some studies in terms of cost comparisons as to an existing base in Hay River as opposed to perhaps an option like Inuvik or Tuktoyaktuk as the base of operations for MTS. And would he share those studies and findings or analysis with the committee? Let's see.
Thank you, Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is only our second operation year season. We haven't looked at those things yet. If members remember correctly, we bought this thing in December and we had to have it up and running by the following May, which we did. And we made a profit the first year with all the challenges that we had around that, with one-time costs associated with bringing boats back down from the high Arctic to insurance and Lloyd's of London and inspections and staffing and crewing. There was a huge challenge around that, and the department pulled it off and had got our first year done. We are into our second season. This is our second season. I need to stress that. And we're still trying to fully appreciate all the assets that we have accumulated and the cleaning up of the facility and trying to manpower up and find the most cost-effective way to run this operation. But at this point, we have not sat down already, just because we've had an unfortunate event this year with heavy sea ice that come down to cause us not to be able to deliver to 3 communities. Is we're going to scramble year to and set up operation in Tuktoyaktuk. That's not the case. We're always looking for effective ways to change things. We're taking some lessons learned, as I've said, from this, and we will continue to look at that. But at this point, I cannot see Tuktoyaktuk being on the radar to move our whole operation there. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Nadley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My last question is, I live in Fort Providence. The ice goes out about May the 12th, or thereabouts. And then it follows maybe from there to the
north to Inuvik within a 2-week period. So the river is pretty well open within that period of time. But unfortunately, the Great Slave Lake ice persists to keep the lake frozen, and MTS, their operations, has to stand still during that time, and while the river is flowing freely. And the point that I'm making is that there has been changes in like river breakups. We're seeing changes in terms of the sea ice flow up in the high Arctic, and my question is, how does MTS consider climate change in developing its operational plans? The examples I just made. We're seeing changes. The Northwest Passage is becoming more passable for ocean liners, and things of that nature are happening, and surely the department through MTS has considered those operational factors.
Thank you, Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As I've said earlier in my questioning, I said we were going to do a regional contingency plan on the Department of Infrastructure to help mitigate these extreme events, and that's where we would probably have a look at this, and that's why we're having a look at the Beaufort region, and I've committed that we're going to do that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister. Mr. Nadley?
No.
Nothing further from Mr. Nadley. Next, I have Mr. Blake.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just to your statement, I know you mentioned some high water in July, and I seen it firsthand myself, and I noticed a couple of buoys that were in places they shouldn't be near Sigachik. And how long did it take the department or the Coast Guard to realign those buoys along the Mackenzie River after they were moved out of place by the extremely high waters in the first part of July? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Blake. Minister?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My understanding, without getting the exact timing, but my understanding, it took the Coast Guard about 10 days to reposition the buoys. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Blake.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And at the time when we had it's good for us in Sigachik because we get all this driftwood and all the communities, and we don't usually get that in the spring, but it always makes everybody wonder. Us too, early part of June we get breakup and high waters, but people are always wondering how we don't see barges along the river until towards the end of July. So that question always comes up. It seems like it's a little later than what it used to be, but I'm sure to rebuild all these barges, old stock. So can we see major improvements once we get these new barges that are supposed to be on order, and how long will those barges take to be ready for shipping? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Minister?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Now, we've talked a little bit about these double-hull barges in my member statement about the funding that we secured with the federal government for the $19.5 million, and plus had questions on our contribution. The one nice thing about these, for the people that didn't get to attend the MTC opening in Hay River, we actually had a picture of the barges, and I think we actually have some of the drawings, and maybe I'll commit to bringing them to our briefing as well, so members can get a better understanding of these new design barges. But they're going to be able to haul all types of fuel on there. They're designed for that. They're double hulled. There's 4 of them, and we'll be able to put deck cargo on them. So in a case like this year, instead of having different trips going to the communities, in particular the high Arctic, we'll probably be able to service maybe not only 1, but maybe 2 communities with all their fuel and all their deck cargo in one trip. So that's going to make a significant difference to the delivery times and to the coastal communities. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Blake?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. No, I'm aware there's also other barging companies like Cooper Barging, for example, or Bob's Welding, or I'm not, those are two of the bigger outfits. But you know, when you're a little busier than usual, like it seems you were this summer, do you make use of those other companies as well to service the smaller, you know, closer communities to whether Newvik or um, near Fort Simpson? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. These companies like these two that the member's referring to, they service a different market and do different types of work. Cooper's Barging, for example, maybe a lot of people don't realize, but they don't haul fuel. Their barges are only set up for deck cargo. So in rare extreme cases, they've hauled in fuel on top, but they would be in a tanker. But generally, we don't interfere with each other's businesses. We both conduct our own businesses, and there's a market for that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Blake.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That's all for now. Thanks.
Thank you. Next, Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm just trying to get a clearer picture of this here. So when we talk about $22 million in asset or cash reserves, can you please explain what that reserve is? Is it cash, or is this equipment, or is this product, or is it a combination of everything? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Mr. McCormick. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The $22 million is the approximate bank balance for MTS as of today.
Thank you, Mr. McCormick. Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So can Mr. McCormick explain the bank balance? Is this the liabilities? Does this involve the equipment? Is that $22 million in cash? Is that what it is, or is this assets and product? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Mr. McCormick.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The $22 million is cash. That is money that was generated through MTS operations over the past 2 years. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. McCormick. Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. McCormick. I'm getting a little confused here. So what's the $875 of when it's in the revolving fund? So thank you. Mr.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Mr. McCormick.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The $870,000 would be the accumulated surplus that is sitting in there. So that is the statement of operations, or the income statement side, and transfers over to the balance sheet. So we would have $22 million in cash. We would also have some offsetting liabilities for accounts payable, those sorts of things. And that include the money that would be owed to the N.W.T for the original asset purchases that would be netted off of that. I just want to clarify as well that $870,000 that's currently sitting there does include our contingency as of now for the commitments we've made for the air freight that's going on right at this moment. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. McCormick. Mr. Thompson.
Yeah, thank you. So when the Minister and the Department's going to be coming to committee to present, will we have the actual bottom line, what money we have? Because when I'm hearing $22 million in the bank and $875,000 here, I mean, it sounds like we have $22,875,000 minus liabilities and that. And now I'm sitting here trying to understand this. So if we look at the liabilities, we look at the assets and depreciation of the equipment and that, our numbers actually go down, if I'm understanding this correctly. Can the minister or Mr. McCormick please clarify. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Minister Schuman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So when we come in front of committee next week, we're going to bring you the most up-to-date balance sheet that we have, because that's going to change all the time with liabilities and invoicing and stuff. But the other thing we've got to make quite clear here is we're forecasting that we're going to break even this year, even with all the liabilities of flying all the freight in. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister Schuman. Mr. Thompson.
Okay, so if I understand this correctly, what we're going to do is we're going to see if we didn't have these situations happen, we would have had an extra $3 million from the operations of MTS this year. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Minister Schuman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, approximately we would have had an extra $3 million in revenue to the bottom line. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister Schuman. Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I thank the Minister for that. Got a little bit of clarification, a little bit better there. So when we talk about the rebates to the clients that have these vehicles that are not getting shipped into there, and that's great the department's going to give back the rebates, but will the department make a commitment to these same owners that they will charge them the same freight rate this year for next year? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Minister Schuman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess I got to lay it out maybe a little simpler. We're giving the rebate back for what we're charging people to haul their vehicles in this year, and we're delivering them next year for free. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister Schuman. Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I think the people of the communities are happy with that. What is that cost going to be if we're providing it for free? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Minister Schuman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We can actually maybe get that information for you well, but there's 10 vehicles, and they range from $2,790 to $4,750, depending on their size. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister Schuman. Mr. Thompson.
So roughly about $40,000 different at the high end. Okay, thank you. When we talk about the petroleum revolving fund, and we talk about this, now we're saying that, using the minister's words, and I apologize if I didn't get them exactly right, that they're going to eat the cost of the petroleum, the freight being back and forth. So that's great that we're getting the petroleum and that into the communities, and I think that's great to hear. So my question, though, is this revolving fund, how does that impact the cost of fuel next year for all communities? Because I'm assuming the purchase is bulked, that's how the cost is, you come out with it. You're able to purchase the best product or best price, and now we're seeing using the freight to pay for it. Now it's going to be another cost to all Northwest Territories, just not that, because we're going to see the smaller communities being impacted. And maybe I'm wrong, but could we please clarify that? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Mr. McCormick.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The Petroleum Products Revolving Fund also has attached to it a stabilization fund of $1 million, and that is a fund for stabilizing the fuel prices. So those extra costs that we're going to incur this year will sit in the stabilization fund. There is a band for that we're allowed. The minister is allowed to charge a little bit up and down on the fuel prices, but there is no urgency. Assuming we don't have another year like we have this year, there'll be no urgency to jump that all in fuel next year. We can take some time and work our way out of that stabilization fund, Mr. Chair, and that is exactly what that stabilization was designed for, so we wouldn't have these big price shocks hitting consumers from year to year. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. McCormick. Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, and I thank Mr. McCormick for explaining that. Will the minister provide this information at the meeting and explain exactly how that works so we can understand that? Because I mean, for me, I understand a little bit better, but I'd like to be able to get that information out to my communities, even though they're not on the barge shipment process, but with this petroleum products eating the cost, the freight, it has an impact, or could have an impact. And I'm hearing from Mr. McMorrow that it doesn't, but can we get that clarified and presented at the committee meeting? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Minister Schuman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, we can make sure we have someone from Petroleum Products to explain it to committee. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister Schuman. Mr. Thompson.
Mr. And I greatly appreciate that. So when I was down south there, I ran into a couple of individuals and they talked about these airships, new technology. Has the government started to look at that as potentially something that we can, MTS could get into in the future? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Minister Schuman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. When they become commercially available, we'll have a look at it. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister Schuman. Mr. Thompson.
I hope that the minister and the department actually really looks at it, because from what I understand, it sounds like a good idea. The last question I do have is just in regards to when he talked about the cost of freight going up the Dempster to Tuck. Now we have that road there. So have you guys, or will you guys look at the cost of doing this? Because I understand that the railhead is here. This is the cost going up the railhead, but here's the cost going up on the Dempster and Tuck Highway. Because I mean, to me, that we spent a lot of money on building that road, and here's an opportunity to maybe help the communities in the Bodell there. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Minister Schuman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First of all, we got to point out there's millions of liters of fuel that gets shipped up there. This isn't one of Bassett's B train loads here we're talking about. We're talking millions of liters. The wear and tear on the highway would be on the Dempster and stuff would have to be considered. But right now, as you start moving commodities anywhere around this country, marine and rail is the cheapest way to do it, and there's no getting around that at this point. There's also safety and environmental issues if you were trucking it. There'd be more risks involved in that. So there's some other factors involved here, but the cheapest way still presently in today's society is marine and rail. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister Schuman. Next on the list, we have Mr. Simpson.
Thank you, Mr. Blake. This is MTS is a big deal in Hay River. It's a big deal in my constituency. And a lot of people were glad when the government came in and purchased MTS. And I don't think anyone saw it as the government was coming in to save Hay River. The government was coming in to save themselves because they require MTS to deliver fuel. And I think that when I was up on at the All Candidates Forum, I sat on stage with Minister Schuman and I said the government shouldn't be in the business of business. And lo and behold, a couple years later, we're running a shipping company. And it's not easy, and government isn't made to run these types of organizations. You have to be responsive, you have to be nimble, and those are two things that the government isn't known for. And I think that this exemplifies the need to move towards a different type of governance model, something similar to the Power Corporation, cost recovery model, where you can attract the right type of people to do the work, people who have history in the shipping industry. And there's been a lot of talk about shipping out of somewhere else, and the minister's pointed out many times that a lot of fuel comes through Hay River. And when I look out my window, I can see the tank farm where the fuel is delivered to, and I see trains day and night sometimes, for the entire summer coming through. There's an amazing amount of fuel, and you couldn't even imagine how many trucks would be required to ship that up and down the highway. And so I think that I'd like to see the numbers. I'd like to see the minister come up with these numbers, and I think they'd probably be extraordinary to see how expensive it is to ship it via truck. But like I said, I think that we need to seriously look at moving towards a different type of governance model, and not, a few years down the road we'll start thinking about it. I think we need to look at it now and see how quickly we can move towards it. We need a long-term plan, and we need a short-term plan of how we're going to start getting there. There's a lot of small things. There was the sailing schedule, I think, went out to consumers in May. It usually goes out in November. So right there, that's a small example of something that was 6 months behind right off the bat. And I think that's indicative of a lot of the other small issues. And you know what, we do have a lot of the right people in Hay River to run this as it is. We bring a lot up, and the Marine Training Center is addressing that. But we have a lot of the personnel in Hay River. And I think that they need to be able to work in an environment that, like I said, is responsive and nimble. And one of the other issues too with when you discuss, maybe shipping out of somewhere else, maybe moving somewhere else, is the fact that there's the personnel in Hay River who've been doing this for years. It's not just the physical infrastructure, but it's also the people. So those are just a few things I wanted to point out, both for the minister and for the public, because there's been a lot of talk of maybe we need to ship out from somewhere else, but there's a reason that Hay River exists as it does, and it's because of, mostly because of commercial shipping and commercial fishing. It is the port of the north for a reason. So I just wanted to point that out. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson. Minister Schuman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Comments noted.
Thank you, Minister Schuman. Mr. Simpson.
Nothing further, thank you.
Thank you. Next on the list, we have Mr. Van Tine.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and certainly appreciative of everybody's comments. And I'm also, I'd be remiss if I didn't say that, I appreciate that a lot of people think this way, that we need to be very kind of thankful, grateful for the efforts that the government of Northwest Territories has put in terms of saving what was a sinking ship, for lack of a better term, and appreciating the efforts that the government has done to make sure that these critical services are being provided to residents of the Northwest Territories. So I want to commend the department for that. But this really does lead to what does the future look like for MTS, and I appreciate that the minister and the department are going to come and present to standing committee in the coming days. And so I'll put it here, though, on the floor because it has been touched on, but more detail would certainly be what we'd be looking for in the presentation. That is, what is the future of the MTS going to look like? Some have suggested that there needs to be a new governance model, and right now it's essentially, although it's running as under a revolving fund, it's essentially a division of the government of Northwest Territories. Are we going to, have we put any planning into it? Will it remain that way? Will it maybe be considered a Crown Corporation at some point in time, maybe a P3 operator, or in fact maybe even an outright sale to an owner-operator? What would be the operation model that the government is considering? Is it just status quo, or are we doing work to actually consider other models? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Minister?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As I've stated in the House, this is early days on this purchase of this asset, but we're having a look at those options going forward. As I've said in the House many times, we need more than 1 or 2 seasons data to have a look at this, but the department is certainly having a look at various models of what the end game will be, and those decisions will be made once we get more data and input to be able to make a decision around that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Van Tine?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Are we aware of any other jurisdiction that has a similar model where it's a government-operated marine transportation system? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Minister?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Off the top of my head, no, but we would have to do a jurisdictional look to see if that was something out there similar to ours. The only thing that comes to mind to me at some of the FPT tables is Newfoundland and their ferry system, but that's not doing cargo or stuff. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Van Thyn?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. When the minister refers to data, what kind of data, like what kind of data sets are required for us to make some of these future decisions with regard to the government's model or business model for MTS?
Thank you. Minister?
Well, I can maybe take a crack at it, and then maybe the deputy or someone wants to step in. But you know, it's no different than the easiest way I look at it from a business point of view is, first of all, if I was a business guy, why would I want to buy MTS? When you get into a situation like this here, there's so much risk there that to me, for that type of investment, it would be very challenging to turn a profit in this environment. There's so much risk involved around climate change alone and even sovereignty. But you know, there's a number of things I think that we'll have to have a look at it from a data point of view. It would even be from a policy perspective to regional uses of what's going on up in the high Arctic. There's a number of, I think, of factors that need to be considered in this, and you know, I don't think the politics is also something I think that comes into it to a certain degree, but does it make sense? You'd have to look at our other crown corporations and their governance model and how they're working. I think the previous question is there other models out there of other governments running an operation like this that would certainly probably feed into that as well. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister. Mr. Van Thyn?
Okay. Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate that, what the minister's saying, but with all due respect, I mean, we're just using other terminologies now. I mean, data is one thing. I've heard the word factors. We got to consider factors. We got to consider risks. We got to consider politics. And so I appreciate that that's what we're doing. I guess what I'm trying to understand a little bit is a better perspective on what we actually are doing. What is the information that we are gathering? Are we actively developing a business plan? You know, I'll use the airport as a example just for a moment. That has a 5-year plan and it has a 20-year master plan. I mean, is this something that we're giving consideration to as it relates to MTS? Are we developing the 5-year plan? Are we developing the 20-year master plan? And what are those things that we are considering? That would be the data, the factors, the risks, and the politics involved in developing those types of plans. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Van Thyn. Mr. Guy?
Sure. So some of the information that we would need to develop a long-term plan for the organization, which is what we're looking at, are things as what are the size of the market, what's the stability of the market that you need to stabilize the operation. We got this equipment. It was in condition where it needed some investment to deal with some deferred maintenance issues. Clearly, it wasn't sustaining itself to what would be an optimum level based on the challenges previous care had with shrinking market, shrinking customer base. So part of the work we're doing is to figure out what a stable amount of business revenues you need to sustain this organization in a self-supporting mode so that it can fund its life cycle needs, also fund its your operations, and be able to be resilient enough to respond to the types of situations we're here talking about today, but also to be able to respond to growth and shrinking in its own market as a result of economic upturn and downturn. So part of what we're doing now is looking at some of those markets, and part of the work we're doing around some of the additional revenues that we're generating through other work that this organization or this MTS does, are being used to fund some of those life cycle costs, are being used to fund some of the fixed costs of the operation. But we need to have a good understanding with more than 1 or 2 years of data to get a good handle on what it would be to have a viable self-supporting organization, whether it's a Crown, whether it's another organization. We did some work last year. We did a study to look at what some of the business models were, and it was clear through that work we needed to have a little bit more operating time under our belt to come to better conclusions. We continue to look at those options, and we'll be continuing to feeding the data we collect into that work that we're doing. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Van Thyn?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And yeah, that's the kind of information that I like to hear, is that you know, revenues, factors around operations, operational costs, what markets we're looking at, maintenance costs. Of course, we heard about climate change earlier and life cycle costs. So those are the things that I would normally see as the factors and information that we have to consider with regard to developing a model of governance or an operating model. I appreciate that the department needs more time to observe and get information so they can make a better case, I suppose. But will the minister commit then to presenting us a little bit more detailed information in the presentation, the public presentation coming up, and also maybe commit to developing a 5-year plan similar to that of the airport, which is currently operating off of a revolving fund? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Van Thyn. Minister?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We can certainly commit to developing a longer-term 5-year business plan and having those discussions and be able to update committee once we have that work done. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Next, I have Mr. Testart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I thank my honourable colleagues for starting the work on asking questions around the governance structure. So the deputy spoke to the need to find a self-sustaining model or self-sustaining revenue in the market before the government kind of cuts this loose and stops subsidizing it. So I know that currently MTS is servicing communities and commercial or industrial operations outside of the Northwest Territories. Can the minister just provide the jurisdictions where MTS is pursuing work? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Testart. In the meantime, while the minister is conferring, I want to welcome our visitors to the gallery, Ms. Deborah Richards, Constituency Assistant for the Nahende riding. Welcome. Minister?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. MTS is presently operating where it traditionally has in the past. So majority of our work is in the Northwest Territories, with some work in Nunavut and a small amount in Alaska. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Testart?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And that's what has me concerned about maintaining MTS as an in-house essential service provider. That's the stated policy objective of the purchase and how the organization is being run. The need to find revenues to sustain the operating costs of the organization has led to the pursuit of opportunities elsewhere. But that leads the G&W-T into direct competition with private sector actors. And if we're crossing international boundaries to do that, that could set up the G&W-T for a whole bunch of liabilities as it relates to international trade treaties. Has the government G&W-T done a risk assessment for the pursuit of these commercial opportunities, both across interprovincial and interterritorial boundaries and international boundaries? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Testart. Mr. Guy?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So the work that we are doing is, as the Minister said, the traditional operating area of the entity, the assets we bought. The work that we do, for example, this year in Alaska was moving a power plant from a location in North Slope to ultimate destination will be in Alberta somewhere. So it's coming back up the Mackenzie River to Hay River, where it will be, I believe, trucked to southern Canada. The work in Nunavut is work that we have done in the past. Most of it is people or customers that want their materials shipped out of Hay River. There is no other organization that offers a service from Hay River to Nunavut this time to compete with. The international work, we have consulted with the Department of Justice, and they have looked at any of the trade implications, and that work is ongoing. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Testart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So risk assessment is underway or is in progress? Is that correct? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Testart. Mr. Guy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm not quite sure I understand what the risk the member's referring to, but we have done an assessment on whether we can compete in this market and do this work, and understanding is that we can. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Testart.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chair. So I understand that customers may want the service, and it's a unique service. When it was NTCL, it was a private business and wasn't subject to the same trade requirements, shall we say. So if the N.W.T is operating is directly competing in private sector markets, both domestically and internationally, it could open itself up for liability as it relates to trade rules. And this is something that's been expressed to me by both private sector actors and just my own awareness of trade deals, including the new NAFTA. So is any thought being given to those issues as it relates to the management or the organizational structure of MTS? Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Guy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think those considerations would be factors into the long-term organizational structure that we eventually land on with this entity. It should be noted that the previous carrier was a Crown Corporation for many, many years before it was privatized and failed. So as it was a Crown Corporation, it was competing in those markets before privatization. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Testart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Crown Corporation also subject to different rules than the government as an operating entity. And, the minister said famously on a Small Business Day when we pressed him on questions that the N.W.T is not a business. It's up to individual businesses to come forward. Well, as it relates to MTS, it is a business, and it's in the business of shipping. And the longer there's uncertainty around the arm's length nature of this, the more liability the N.W.T potentially brings itself on from people who feel that the government is unfairly competing in both domestic and international markets. It's imperative that we set MTS on a clear course forward. There's been a consultant's report that has made recommendations on what kind of model it should take, and if that work was undertaken now and it became a Crown Corporation or a special operating agency, the government could continue to subsidize its operations through direct funding or through subsidies that would not be inappropriate given its nature as still a government-owned business or a special operating agency. So from what the evidence we've heard today is that MTS will be any decisions about its future will take 5 years potentially. We might again accrue enough liability to potentially set us up for failure. So members are raising these concerns. They have today, they have previously, they have in business plan reviews, they have on the floor of the House. Is the minister taking these concerns seriously? And can he commit to addressing these more fulsomely than just planning to address them sometime in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Minister?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The member's kind of all over the place there. First of all, we need to pursue some of this private work. If we don't pursue some of this private work that's out there, the cost with the running this operation would be enormous. I don't think the member would like to see $5 a litre in the communities, because if all of a sudden you shrink your market to where it's half the size of what you got and you continue to have a fixed cost to run this operation, the costs are going to be horrendous. We're operating this asset exactly the way and pursuing revenues, just like the company that ran it previously to us, without any effects on the market. Our staff was just recently in Cambridge Bay discussing with community members the challenges that we had this season. They made it quite clear to us when we were there, they do not want us to pull out of their market. They've made it very clear, and they've had 3 other sailing ships that already service their community this year. As the deputy said, there's a number of people in these communities that want their services and goods brought out of Hay River. They don't want to be bringing it from Vancouver or around from Montreal. There's a place in this market. It's a small market. Everyone's doing their own thing, and we will continue to pursue the private sector business to offset our costs to run this operation. We've clearly laid out what the deputy said, the data and information we're trying to pull together, but we're going to make a decision in the long run if we're going to make this a Crown corporation or other business models or what other options are available to us. But it does not make sense for us not to pursue some of these other opportunities that lay out there. And there's a number of people out there that can't do what this MTS does. They don't have the low draft barges, they don't have the type of equipment we do, they don't have the staffing that we do. So at this point, on the floor of this House, we are going to continue to commit to pursuing other revenue sources. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Short follow-up, Mr. Testart, 20 seconds.
Yeah, I just want to use this opportunity to clarify my comments. I'm not advocating for MTS to stop doing the work it's doing or pursuing revenues. I'm saying it's an inappropriate governance model to do so. And my concern is liability and the principles of fairness and competition. And I think the minister is mischaracterizing my comments as saying stop. I'm not issuing a stop work order for MTS, Mr. Chair. I'm saying that if we're going to continue to do this work, we need to do it properly.
Thank you, Mr. Testart. Your time has expired. Next I have Mr. Beaulieu.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I'm not really sure where to start with this. I haven't been obviously impacted in the people that I represent, but I see that other people around the territories have been impacted by, I guess, what we don't want to use the word mistakes, but maybe a bit of a miscalculation on the part of the people doing this. For the most part, the weather, the ice, and all that is pretty well consistent from year to year. I think that that it shows a. I mean, I'm not saying it's the same every year. I mean, the one thing that's predictable is that the weather is not predictable. That's what I'm saying. And when NTCL or a company like that operates, or an MTS operates, they would operate with that knowledge that the weather is not predictable. So I think that rather than a mistake or blaming Mother Nature, I think it was a miscalculation on the part of the MTS, and that miscalculation cost a lot of people a lot of money in Mr. The member from N.W.T's riding, and also for Nunavut. I also feel that it was a miscalculation on a part of the government period to buy NTCL. Originally, I was not in favor of it, but had no say in it. There were other companies that would bid for the work and felt that they had more knowledge of the shipping than what the government would bring in. But then that's water under the bridge. So I have a question for the minister, and that is, after this year, what is MTS doing to debrief to make sure that they try to do better calculations when they're trying to ship into those communities that were not able to complete the shipping in. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Bolio. Minister?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First thing I want to highlight for the member, I think us buying MTS had a positive impact on him because N.W.T had 2 years of delivery of goods and fuel in his riding. What we are going to do from this point forward is as I've said in various different statements, we're going to hire another communications person to work closely with the communities and on goods and delivery of services to the communities. We're working closely with Coast Guard on the sea ice issue and a number of other issues that we're going to address hopefully with them going forward around navigational aids and all kinds of things around the sea ice conditions and marine infrastructure investment and stuff. But like I've said in the House before, and people continue to say this is an error, and it's not an error. There was a multitude of effects that got us to this point, and I disagree with the member. Us buying MTS was probably the smartest thing we've done. Because if we wouldn't have bought this, the chances of even having delivery up there by us wouldn't have happened. I believe that company would have been stripped and sold out, and we would have had to rely on delivery to the Arctic coast coming around from Montreal or Vancouver, which would have added significant cost to the government of Northwest Territories and to the residents in those communities. But that's a point we can ponder, but that's my point on it, and I believe that we did the right thing to service these communities. An unfortunate event happened this year. We're taking an unprecedented step to help mitigate these circumstances. We're delivering all the fuel to the communities that need it to make sure they get through the winter. We're taking an unprecedented step of delivering all the goods and commodities to the community on a case-by-case basis. We've reached out to every one of the customers in the communities. Paulatuck has 33. Kalugtuck had 11 and Cambridge Bay has 24, and we've talked to every one of them. And, you know, there's some people that were clearly upset that the boats didn't arrive, but that's the challenge of living in the north, and that's the challenge of climate change. We're taking this step, which is going to cost us a significant amount of money to be able to help those people up there. And they're quite happy. Can you imagine what would be going on in this house right now if we didn't take the unprecedented step of flying in all these commodities and goods into these communities? And that could have been the case if it was in a private stakeholder's hands. So I think we did the right thing, and we just need to remind people that this is a challenging environment. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister. Does that answer your question about debriefing, Mr. Bolio?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, when I was talking about not being effective, I was talking about what happened up there. I realized that stuff was delivered in Lutzelkeda like was every other year for years and years. So my other question is, the minister referred to the cost of trucking fuel into Inuvik. For example, I wouldn't advocate trucking fuel to Tuck, but Inuvik would be another situation. Has the MTS looked at the possibility of making or building something like a synchro lift that could pull the barges and ships up on shore in Inuvik to see if that's something that is feasible? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As I've stated in previous questions, we're talking millions of liters of fuel. So why would it does not make sense to build a synchro lift in Inuvik. We already bought an existing facility. The majority of the fuel comes on the railhead to Hay River. The railhead does not go to Inuvik, as far as I know, unless I'm missing something. We're talking 40 to 50 million liters a year. You start trucking that up to Dempster, the wear and tear, the safety issues, the environmental issues that come with that, the costs associated with that, I don't even have to do an analysis on it. I know it's going to be way more than you'd ever ship out of Hay River. Shipping by rail and marine is by far the most cost-effective way to do this. And that's why we have no intention of building a synchro-lift in Inuvik as long as I'm the minister. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister. Mr. Bolio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Might be cheaper than flying fuel in, though. Mr. Chairman, it is very difficult to sit here and without any information at all. We don't have any information. I'm asking the minister if they had looked at something. He says they don't have to look at it. He's talking about wear and tear on the road. I think that if you drive stuff in the winter over the highway, a gravel road driven in the winter time can handle a lot more when the road is frozen than obviously the minister realizes. But what I'm saying is we should look at other possibilities, because unless the department or this MTS does a proper debriefing and does better planning and does better calculations on how to deliver material and fuel into those Arctic communities, we're going to have to start looking at something else. You can't have a repeat of this. The possibility of building something that may appear costly today. I mean, it appeared costly to me when the government bought NTCL. I wasn't in favor of that, but like I said, I had no say. So that's a costly thing that the government is prepared to do, but in order to make sure that they don't make the same miscalculation in the future, I'm saying take a look at that. What's the cost of that? We don't know. The minister's not going to look at it because it's too costly, but he doesn't know what the cost is, but just knows it's going to be too costly. He thinks it's going to be damaging to the road, but if the road is frozen, it may not be. So those are the type of things I think that the government's going to have to look at, and not just say we didn't make a mistake, we're not listening to anyone, we're going to fly in what we can, and everything's going to be fine in the future. I think we should start to make sure that the government is looking at what they've done this year, and to make sure that doesn't happen again in the future. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Expired. There's no one further on my list, so I will allow closing comments to Minister Schuman. Minister Schuman?
I'm going to make it brief, but one thing I just talked to the deputy, what I want to do when we come in front of committee next week, I'm going to find out exactly how many liters of fuel we deliver to the Arctic communities, and I'm going to get a quote how much it is to truck it to Inuvik to give committee a fair comparison on what it would cost. And I think they're going to be pretty shocked. But for my closing comments, I thank all committee members for their questions. I think it's good that we have a public forum here to get out this information to the public. What I need to reassure the public when they're listening to this is the government of the Northwest Territories has took the unprecedented step of buying MTS to protect the people of the Northwest Territories around delivery of fuel and goods to the communities, and particularly the high Arctic. We took the unprecedented step to do that. I believe it was the right step to do, and I believe Cabinet does, and I believe most members do. We are operating in a very challenging environment. Some people want to put the blame on us for the commodity and goods and fuel not getting delivered this year, and I'm not going to wear that. This is an unprecedented event that happened. There's a multitude of things that took place. The department is working very hard to mitigate this. We're taking the unprecedented step of flying in these things to these people so they can get on with their lives in a cost-effective way. And I don't think you would have seen that if the private sector would have purchased this asset. So I thank committee for their questions today, and I look forward to a briefing next week. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister. Mr. Bolio?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I move that the chair rise and report progress.
Thank you, Mr. Bolio. There's a motion on the floor to report progress. Motion is in order and undebatable. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion is carried. I will rise and report progress. Sergeant at Arms, you may escort the witnesses from the chamber. Thank you to the witnesses. Thank you to the minister.
May I have the report, Member Hay River North?
Mr. Speaker, your committee has been considering Bill 7, Chartered Professional Accountants Act, and Minister Statement 103-18(3) Marine Transportation Services, and would like to report progress with one motion carried that Bill 7 is ready for third reading as amended. And Mr. Speaker, I move that the report of the Committee of the Whole be concurred with.
Do I have a seconder? Member for N.W.T. Motion's in order. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion carried. Massey. Third reading of bills. Minister of Municipal Community Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I move, second by the Honourable Member for Range Lake, that Bill 8, Emergency Management Act, be read for the third time. And Mr. Speaker, I do request a recorded vote. Thank you.
Member requested for a recorded vote. Motions in order. To the motion. Question's been called. All those in favor, please stand.
The member for Inuvik-Boot Lake, the member for Range Lake, the member for Great Slave, the member for Yellowknife South, the member for Inuvik Twin Lakes, the member for Hay River South, the member for Tabacha, the member for Hay River North, the member for Mackenzie Delta, the member for Yellowknife North, the member for Cam Lake, the member for Tunada-Weladay, the member for Nahende, the member for Frame Lake, the member for Decho, the member for Nunakput.
All those opposed, please stand. All those abstain, please stand. The result of the recorded vote, 16 in favor, 0 opposed, 0 abstention. Motion is carried. Third reading of bills. Third reading of bills. Mr. Clerk, orders of the day.
Orders of the day for Wednesday, October 24th, 2018, 1:30 p.m. Prayer, minister statements, member statements, returns to oral questions, recognition of visitors in the gallery, acknowledgments, oral questions, returns to written questions, replies to the Commissioner's opening address, petitions, reports of standing and special committees, reports of committees on the review of bills, tabling of documents, notices of motion for first reading of bills, motions, first reading of bills, second reading of bills, consideration in committee of the whole of bills and other matters, Minister Statement 19-18.3, Minister Statement 103-18.3, Table Document 215-18.3, Report of the Committee of the Whole, third reading of bills, Bill 7, orders of the day.
This House stands adjourned till Wednesday, October 24th, 2018, 1:30 p.m.